Hello there. This is No Extra Words, One Person Search for Story, Season 3, Chris's audio book blog for April 17th, 2019. Tomorrow, which is when I'm hoping this episode will drop for you all, is Poem in Your Pocket Day. Hope you're having a good one out there. And I know I said I was going to talk about other things today, but I couldn't let this go by without getting up and personal with poetry. If you're not a poetry reader, please stay tuned. I'm not going to try to convert you. I just want, especially my non-poetry peeps, to hear what I've got to say. So, been participating in the Unread Shelf project for 2019, and one of the challenge for April was to read your most recently acquired book on your Unread Shelf. And so I picked up Michael Rosen's What is Poetry, which I bought in January. And I was reading through that, and I thought, there's no way that I can let this month go by without talking about poetry with my No Extra Words peeps. Because here's the thing about poetry. Everything that you've been taught about poetry has been taught to you in the wrong way. That's just a fact. I have a good friend who's a music teacher, and for some reason the topic of poetry came up the other day, and I could tell she did not want to talk about it. But I said to her, imagine if we taught poetry the way we teach music. Wouldn't that be great? Think about how we teach music to kids. We start with simple songs when they're little, Twinkle, Twinkle, Little Star, A, B, C, D, E, F, G. And as they get a little bit bigger, we add a tiny bit of theory to that. You plunk out songs on your xylophone or your recorder or whatever it is music teachers use. But we continue to let them sing for joy. And we continue to keep the melodies and stuff pretty simple. And we sort of build in this theory as we continue to allow them to make music. And sometimes we allow them to just sing with the radio for no reason because that's fun. And you don't have to know where middle C is to do that. Imagine if we taught poetry that way. We start the same way. We teach little kids about rhyming words, and we play with, limericks and jokes, and we start to read them Shel Silverstein, and we make up funny rhymes, and we do all that when they're little. And then we just stop, like abruptly, out of nowhere. Maybe we keep the silly poetry going for a while through their elementary years. Maybe not. Occasionally, somebody will want to teach you what a syllable is, and we'll have you write a haiku. That kind of thing will happen when you're young. And then one day you wake up and you're 14 and they dump Romeo and Juliet at you and teach you what I am is, and you count in syllables and write in sonnets, and you're like, whoa, what happened? And you never go near poetry again. Does that sound familiar to anyone? Is that the way you were taught? That's what I was taught. That's the way I see most kids around me being taught. And so they, first of all, grow up thinking that all poetry rhymes and all poetry is funny because that's all they hear when they're little. And then suddenly when they're adults or high schoolers, they think, well, all poetry for grown-ups is dumb and annoying and either has this weird meter or doesn't rhyme or rhymes weird because that's what they're taught. Imagine if we built in a bunch of playing with words in between those two extremes. And imagine even if we didn't have to get to counting iambs and all of that technical stuff unless we wanted to. Most of us are not going to write symphonies, guys. Why do we have to write sonnets? I don't get it. And I love poetry. Anybody who's listened to this show knows we do poetry every poetry month. Every season has looked different, so what we do looks different. But I mean, I've gone on the road and I interviewed a poet, and I've done like poetry submissions, and I've talked about poet biographies, and I've done a lot of that. But I don't think I've ever really shared my personal story with why I like poetry. And it's a continually evolving story as it's evolved this week. So that's why I'm here, is to tell that story. Because here's the thing. I didn't always feel this way. I think for a lot of years of my life, I felt like a lot of you. Like I would run across the occasional poem that I liked or knew. The occasional poet that you'd hear on the radio during Poetry Month or something, and it was like, yeah, I like Langston Hughes, sure, I like William Carlos Williams, who doesn't, right? But I would never read it. Like, I'd never get a poetry book from the library and just read poetry for fun. Like, that would never be a thing. Certainly, I didn't know who poets were at all, contemporary poets. So that was me. as a younger person, and even to some extent as a younger librarian. But I came gradually to it. And there were a couple things that brought me to it. First of all, my sister, who knows me well, got me when I was traveling in 2003 a book of travel essays, which I've talked about on a previous episode in season 2. Never in a Hurry by Naomi Shihab Nye, and I loved that book. You should go back. I think it's episode 101 where I talk about that book. And I carried it all the way through New Zealand. I've read it many, many times since. And it made me, of course, as you do, want to go back and read more by this author. Well, she is primarily a poet. And it took a while before I was brave enough to take on that, to actually start to read her poetry books. And I'm just reading one of them now that's been out for a couple of years. So I started reading her and just kind of dabbling a little bit with more contemporary poetry. And then pretty early in my library career, 2 things happened. First of all, she edited a collection of poetry called Time You Let Me In, 25 Poets Under 25. So I picked that up because it had her name on it. And it was really the first time that I had read contemporary new voices in the genre. And that's what the book is really about. It's dated now. I wish we had 25 new poets under 25 because this book is something like 15 years old now. But it was so fresh, and it, the book was really about how we in the literary canon don't often make room for these new voices. And so it's a wonderful, delightful read. And we'll get the names of some poets in front of you. And of course, the other thing that happened is I started listening to the Writer's Almanac. Someday I really do want to talk about my complicated relationship with Garrison Keillor. Now is not the time. But here's what I will say. It was very sad to me that the Writer's Almanac suddenly disappeared. And that's what happened. When Garrison Keillor was fired by Minnesota Public Radio, the show went off the air and all of the archives just disappeared. I think you may be able to get them now. But it was like the show was canceled. The podcast archives went away. Everything went completely away. And I don't want to pass judgment about whoever made that decision. And again, I don't want to talk about Garrison Keillor right now. But to me, the Writer's Almanac was just about so much more than Garrison Keillor. If you'd never heard it, it was a daily show on NPR where he would do, I think it was like a 3-minute thing. And it was a little bit of history and a little bit of literary history. And then he'd read a poem. And the poems just came from all over the place. Contemporary poets, well-known poets, not so well-known poets. And just, I would get it on the podcast and I would binge listen. And just listening to 15 or 16 poems in a row from different voices and different styles, it started to unlock the potential of what was out there. And so I started to embrace poetry a little bit more. But I was not like a fanatic about it. Poetry month would come and I was a librarian, so I'd put the books on display and I'd hold some events. We'd do like a poetry slam or something like that. And I never felt confident in my own poetry writing. I liked writing it, but I never felt like I could really do it. And I kind of focused more on poetry writing and then just sort of put the books on display and really encouraging kids' poetry books. I remember one summer when I was a young librarian, we really pushed those during the summer because they tend to hide. And again, most kids have the 3 authors they know. They know Shel Silverstein. They know Jack Perletsky. There's probably one more. Douglas Florian, maybe. And that's great. And those are wonderful poets. I mean, I was reading my kids some Shel Silverstein today. But I think we do kids a disservice because some poetry isn't funny and some of it doesn't rhyme. And it's still fun for kids, even if that's the case. But we leave those out. So I'd push those. And then I came to be a school librarian. And Poetry Month came along in April, as it always does. And I thought, I wonder what's going to happen. I wonder what the teachers are going to teach. Who's going to ask for what? What poetry is going to go out. And I got into the first week of April and it was crickets. And I thought, nobody's going to push this unless I do. So I grabbed some poetry books and did some exercises with kids, shared them as read alouds, put some stuff on display. And that first year was fun. we wrote some concrete poems, and I invented a Google writing poetry exercise that I still use that just I kind of made up and did with the middle schoolers. And it's really fun, and it's still a way that I like to create poetry. And then I started ordering some more books to bulk up the collection just a little bit. And year 2, I read about this thing called Poem in Your Pocket Day and started pushing it with the kids. And then the arts festival was the week after Poetry Month that the school was putting on. They said, hey, can you get some kids to read some poems? And so it became a thing, and it became part of my identity. And for 3 weeks, because spring break is 1, so April's only 3 weeks long in the school world. For 3 weeks, we were all poetry. We were wall-to-wall poetry. We put everything down. Like, we put down our information literacy and that kind of stuff and just take a break and do poetry. And poetic things. I'd write 6-word memoirs with some of the kids, the older kids. And at the same time, I, in my personal life, actually started reading some poetry aimed at adults because I was so immersed in poetry aimed at teenagers because I was trying to get more for the collection and trying to sort of suck every dollar because who's got a poetry budget, right? So I started getting the occasional book from the library, and I started reading a little more of the classics. Like, I read a lot of William Carlos Williams, and I read some Emily Dickinson, and then I started getting like compilations on different contemporary poets. And I will be the first to say I really, really like poetry, but I never know what to read. I don't have a list of contemporary poets. Mary Oliver died like a couple months ago, and I had no idea who that was. I am not an expert at all. Most of my poetry recommendations I get off Goodreads or Bookstagram or places like that, and I just throw them on my to-be-read list and read them. I'm reading right now Naomi Shihab Nye's Voices in the Air, Poems for Listeners, and she's got great back matter where she talks about poets she references and things like that. And that is awesome because that helps me build my list. It's like, oh, I need a book from that person, and that helps me. And I've kind of gotten in the habit of, I always just kind of have a poetry book by somebody out from the library that I'm just kind of slowly working my way through. And that's a pretty recent habit for me. But I like it. Like, I don't read poetry books fast. It forces me to slow down. I think that's the thing, especially this month. I had a huge TBR list in April, and I've been reading and reading and reading like a maniac. A lot of things that were quick reads, kids' books, graphic novels. I was just burning through books, and that feels good, but can be a little disconcerting, you know? And to have a couple of poetry books, because I was doing that Voices in the Air, and I'm also currently working through a book called Eat This Poem, which is a combination of poetry and recipes. I think it was originally a blog. And those force me to breathe and slow down, which is huge. Because one of the points of poetry is it's not meant to be tackled fast. You can get through a poetry book in an hour if you want to. But you're not going to get as much out of it because there's layers. There's so much to it that it wants to be read again. It wants to be reflected on. And that is what this Michael Rosen book did so well that I really like this book. If you are somebody who's intimidated by poetry, this is a good book for you. It's today's book recommendation you didn't ask for, by the way. And it's a kid's book, so it won't take you long. But what I love about it is it really kind of allows you to deconstruct a little bit and live in that metaphorical language without drumming it over your head. Like, gives you some options. These are some ways you can play with words. These are some ways you can think about this, but you don't have to. And it does it in 2 ways, because it starts with kind of a look into the literary canon. So there's Dickinson and Tennyson and Elizabeth Barrett Browning and, like the big stalwarts of the English language poetry world. And then it goes into this is Michael Rosen who writes poems. So it's like, well, here's one of mine, and this is how it came to be, and this is what I was thinking about when I was trying to do it. So it allows the kid or grown-up reading this book to play the role of the writer and to get into the writer's mind. And it gives you kind of options. But I think one of the things I love about the book is the title, What is Poetry? Because it is how I used to start poetry lessons for a lot of my kids. And I'm going to share with you 2 of the favorite answers that I ever heard. Because when they would give me answers, I would do what teachers do, right? We just pick at them. Because somebody would say, oh, it's stuff that rhymes. Does it have to rhyme? Oh, it has a rhythm. Does it have to have a rhythm? I would just keep asking them. Okay, yeah, that's a thing. And so they'd get annoyed with me. But two of my favorite answers I ever heard for the question first came from a 4th grade girl who said, it's just a big pile of words that somehow relate. Hard to argue with that one. It absolutely is. Or sometimes a little pile of words. And then my other favorite, I had a class of 6th graders once who, after being super annoyed with me for picking at all their answers, they're finally like, it's a poem because it has poemness. Again, can't argue with that at all. And if you read this Michael Rosen book, he never really totally answers the question. And spoiler alert, the book ends with some blank pages that invite the reader to take on that question and figure out what their answer is. But one of the things mentioned is poetry is kind of this agreement between the writer and the reader. If the writer and the reader think it's poetry, it is. Again, a really hard definition to argue with, because there are people who will, say like, this is not a poem, that's not a poem, but we have so much variety in poetry now. We have prose poems. We have, the first season of this show for 2 years, we did flash fiction. The line between flash fiction and poetry is a dotted one, believe me. So there's that. And then we have, 1 or 2 line poems. You could have a 1-word poem. There's so many varieties. And I think that is so true, that if the person creating it thinks it's a poem and I as the reader agree, doesn't matter how many academics throw shade at it and say it is or it isn't. It doesn't really, at the end of the day, matter. So I love the question. And there's a freedom in that, because it gives kids a freedom to say, well, this doesn't feel like a poem that I like, or a poem that I think of as being a poem. And, I think the book does a great job of presenting them with poetry from the canon without forcing them to like it. It sort of gives them options. Here's some things you can do. Or if that didn't work, try this or that, because there are so many options. And we spend a lot of time closing doors, which is why I brought up the example of the sonnet earlier. I just think we had a student teacher my junior year of high school in an AP English class, and her assignment for us on Valentine's Day was to write a sonnet. Really? I mean, talk about a poem with a lot of rules. Now, here's the thing. There's nothing in the world wrong with sonnets. I love sonnets. One of my most impactful books I've ever read in my life is A Wreath for Emmett Till, which is literally a crown of sonnets. Like, there's something really beautiful about a sonnet. And one of the things, and I've talked about that book too on the show, and one of the things that author, Marilyn Nelson, said was being forced to, within that structure, really helped her contain the emotion of writing about something so brutal as what she was doing. So a sonnet has its place, but there almost isn't a form of poetry with more rules than a sonnet. And so if you want to shut a young writer down, start with the rules, right? That's one of the reasons I think that we all get turned off writing poetry. It's one of the first forms of poetry we're told to write is a haiku. Again, talk about the rules. And it's interesting to me that when we teach kids haiku, it really is all about the syllables. Whereas traditionally, haiku is more about the meaning, and the syllable counting allows you to find the rhythm to create that moment that a haiku is trying to create. Haiku, which by the way was invented, somebody woke up one morning, and I used to know the name of this guy, a Japanese poet who sort of pioneered the art form. I don't know if I'm mad, but somebody said, hey, we should write it like this, and did. So every single one of these things English teachers love to deconstruct, at some point was somebody messing around with words and saying, that sounds like an interesting pattern. I'll try that. He doesn't introduce, Michael Rosen, the sort of rhythm of it until closer to the end. And I like that, because he starts with metaphor, simile, personification, narrator, those things that are about making it a moment. And then does the technical stuff. Again, go back to music. You start with the singing of the song and the having of the fun, and then someday your piano teacher hits middle C and tells you where that is. so that you can start to follow and create more intricate things. It's not how you start, it's how you continue. Am I going to convert you to being a poetry reader? Probably not. That's fine. It's totally and completely fine. It's okay with me that there's a small audience. Do I wish it were a little bigger? Yes. I wish it was a little bigger. Because I think that, especially in this place and time in which we live, the things that force us to take a beat are really important. We don't take nearly enough beats. And poetry requires that. It requires our brain to take a beat. It's sort of like the double take. What did I just hear? What was that? Huh. You know that feeling. We don't have enough of that. And we live in a time that lends itself to poetry. We do. Because it's short form, fits really nicely in a tweet. I mean, there's a ton of like Twitter poetry, Instagram poetry. People are out there doing that and using the social media to spread it around. Lyrics are poetry, guys. Sorry, but they are. Graffiti is poetry. Like, we live in a world where it's easy to create it, easy to spread it, easy to make it part of our culture, and yet it's very not. And it's an art form as old as humans. You know, we started by drawing simple pictures, and then we moved on to simple wordplay. That's what we do. I like poetry collections that hang together as a full collection. That's a hard thing to do, but that's one of the things that I have discovered as I've made the switch from the listener of the Writer's Almanac, who liked the occasional poem, to somebody who will actually sit with a collection. It's really nice to see what a writer is trying to do with a body of work. I recently read Letters from the Emily Dickinson Room. It's sadly out of print, by former podcast guest Kelly Russell Agadon. I think that's a great example of what a collection is and can do. And there are great collections out there for kids as well. Just read today a Douglas Florian book called Poetries, which is sort of a picture book poetry compilation all about trees. And you turn the book on its side because trees are tall, right? So a collection can be an awesome way. And there are just so many forms out there. Little kids love concrete poetry, which is where the words form pictures. That's an awesome way to introduce poetry and wordplay, and a fun thing to create. And one of the unsung gems, I think, of the poetry world is the novel in verse. Now, like anything else, that can be done badly, really badly. But it also can be done so well. Speak is really well known by Laurie Halse Anderson. It, again, is one of those where the format lends itself to a hard topic. But a couple of my favorites, I love, this is a great season of the year for this, Shakespeare Bats Cleanup, which is a great book. It's the baseball player who's been sidelined by an injury and has to keep a poetry notebook, and he's better. I like novels in verse that have the narrator play with different poetry forms. There's nothing wrong with a novel completely written in blank verse or completely written in free verse. And by the way, if you don't know those terms that what I'm talking about, it's a super easy Google, or even pretty easy to figure out. Blank verse is something that has a meter to it but no rhyme. Free verse is something that can have a lot of fluctuation with meter or rhyme, so it doesn't really have to sound as poem-ish. But one of the things that Shakespeare Bats Cleanup does is this narrator is working his way through a poetry book. So he's trying different formats, which I love. I just read one this year, which was getting terrible Goodreads reviews, but I really love this book. It was Ronit and Jamal, I think. And it's a Romeo and Juliet retelling in verse of a Palestinian and Israeli teenage couple in present date. And one of the things I love about it is it used some poetry forms I wasn't familiar with, like that are common in Arabic. And, you know, I like it when a book challenges me and makes me want to know, hey, what kind of poem is that? And yet doesn't pull me out of the narrative. And that is an incredibly difficult thing to do. Now, when I talk about it being hard, now I have to make my confession. My relationship with poetry continues to evolve even into this week, when I said for the first time I want to write poetry. Now, I never wanted to write poetry. I didn't even write like bad teenage poetry. I didn't even do that as a kid. Maybe one or two in an old journal, but I'm not a journaler. Again, there are so many non-writerly things about me, it's crazy. But I have been working my way this year through. It's not in front of me. So I don't have the exact title, but it's like daily poetry prompts, and it's by Kelly Russell Aganon, and it has a poetry prompt for every day of the year. And I won't say I've been good about doing every single one. I've had good weeks and bad weeks, but every month I calculate like how good I'm doing for the year. And I was holding it like I've done like 70% of them. And then after March, it dropped to like 60. So I think so far I've done one every day in April, except for maybe one. And I'm really, really enjoying it. And I was flipping back through it, my notebook that I've been keeping along with this book. I'm like, I like what I've created here. I really like it. I want to revise it. I want to do something with it. I'm like, there are a lot of bad reasons. There's a lot of bad things about being a poet. It doesn't pay well. Nobody reads the stuff. Really hard to get published. I read a statistic somewhere that was more Americans write poetry than read it. I have no data to back that up, but I 100% believe that it could be true. So, yeah, I'm also 40. It might be a bad time to do something so completely different, but sometimes the muse pulls you and it's hard to say no. And the other thing that happened is I woke up the other morning and I was thinking about recording this podcast episode, and I was thinking about talking a little bit about novels in verse. And I have this young adult novel I've been working on for a while and not doing a good job of being consistent with, by the way. Probably talked about it here. It was that National Novel Writing Month project for November 2017. I'd like, that might be really cool in verse. Oops. So yeah, my relationship with poetry continues to evolve, and I don't quite know what to do with that. But I do know that my relationship with poetry has changed a lot in 10 years. Certainly a lot in 20, some odd, since that English teacher had us write a sonnet. And now I want to be a poetry evangelist. And I'm about to go cut out 40 poems for Poem in Your Pocket Day. My almost 5-year-old, he might be 5 by the time I put up my next episode, doesn't go to school on Thursdays. We volunteer at a hospital instead. And his crazy mom thought, wouldn't it be a great idea if he picked a handful of poems and we made a bunch of copies of them and he carried them around the hospital, handing them out? Yeah, I just gave myself homework, didn't I? So I guess that's the story of a 21st century poetry evangelist on a journey. Sometimes people ask me, where should I start? Because they want to read poetry or feel like they should tell me that they want to. And it's intimidating, like standing in the poetry aisle of your library / bookstore and staring at that wall of books. Dude, I get it. So they'll ask me, what should I read? Where should I start? And I have no idea. I don't know where to send you. I like Naomi Shihab Nye, for sure. I think, and she writes some sort of teen poetry collections, so I find them very accessible. 19 Varieties of Gazelle might be the one that she's best known for, but she has several. You can't go wrong with Emily Dickinson, I don't think. There are places I wouldn't start. I wouldn't start with Gertrude Stein. Although the picture book I talked about last Poetry Month, Gertrude is awesome. So there's that. It's hard to compilations. If there's kind of a best of 2019, 2018, something like that might be a good place to start. But it's something you kind of got to dabble. And the nice thing about it is you can screw up. I checked out a book. I even had it interlibrary loaned for me. It was called Unmarked. I can't remember the author off the top of my head. I had found it on Goodreads, and my library didn't have it, so they ordered it for me, and I got it, and I was like, this isn't me. Like, I could see that it was good quality and might very well be someone else's cup of tea, but it wasn't mine at all. I'm a children's person, so if you are looking for poetry for kids, that I can do a little bit easier. Gosh, I can't remember her name. I should have taken better notes. But there are fairy tales that are told in a form of poetry that she calls reversos. Google that, you'll find it. And what I love is they are fairy tales. And so you read the poem from the top to bottom, and that's one fairy tale person's perspective. And then she reverses the lines for the second half of the poem. You read them in the opposite order, and it's the other half of the fairy tale's perspective. So there's like the perspective of Little Red Riding Hood, followed by the perspective of the Big Bad Wolf, made by switching the lines around. I don't even begin to know how you start to construct that, but it's awesome. Blue Lipstick is a concrete poetry collection that's really good for your sort of middle grade / middle school people. And there's another one. Technically, it's not my fault. It's a brother-sister character team who do those. So one's the boy perspective and one's the girl perspective. That one is fun for kids. There's a lot out there. Also, the line between picture book and poem is also a blurry one. There are some great picture books out there for people who love poetry. One of my favorites is Peter Reynolds' Ish. It's really about art more than poetry, but it's a little boy who tries to create art and he doesn't like it because it doesn't look the way he wants it to. And someone, I think it's his sister, like he shows her a picture. He's like, does this look like a boat? She's like, well, it's boat-ish. Which is awesome because then he realizes he can draw ishfully and write ishfully and he lives ishfully ever after. So liberating, because I think, again, if you are someone who wants to create in this art form, it's very easy to start to feel the rigidity close in around you because you have to follow the rules. And when it just has to be ish, you don't so much. So that's a fun one. Daniel Finds a Poem is one. We just read a new picture book just out called Poetry, like Poetree, which is super cute. Again, it's only going to appeal to those quirky few of us who want to try to write in this format, but God knows we need to find each other, don't we? So those are some things to start with. I asked on Twitter when I had this revelation that, hey, I think I might actually like writing this stuff. What do I do now? Any advice? Besides the fact that you'll never make any money off of it and nobody wants to read it. Any advice for a would-be poet? And what I was told, which I think are great pieces of advice, was read a lot. Read your own out loud. Listen to other people read theirs out loud. And dabble. Which, if you're out there, Bill, thank you for that piece of advice. Love it. Might be one of my favorite pieces of writing advice I've ever heard. Dabble. Doesn't that sound freeing? Doesn't that sound poetic? Gosh, I think that's maybe what I've been trying to say this whole time with too many words. Is maybe that's what we need to do in this world, is a little bit more dabbling. So, happy Poem in Your Pocket Day. If you haven't celebrated, it's not too late. Poetry Month goes through April 30th. There's about 1 million ways to share a poem with someone, or just read one out loud to the grass. I don't care. I hope that you've gotten something out of this. Thank you anyway for letting me share it. Kind of got it off my chest. I feel like you're all in my confessional now, and you've now all heard that I want to be a poet and I don't know how. So I guess stay tuned for that journey. I do want to talk about libraries, bookstores, browsing, and book serendipity. So maybe we'll get to that one. But as I mentioned, there's a birthday coming up, so things are kind of nuts around here. So I will talk to you very, 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 very soon. Lord willing, and the creek don't rise. Happy Poetry Month. Rhyming or not rhyming, I hope your world finds some fun words in it. Y'all take care.